Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our live audience and to everybody watching in Zoom land. My name is Danny Reed, and I am the Cultural Arts Director and Adult Programming Director of the Miami Beach JCC. So I want to thank you all for coming to this very, very special program. And gentlemen, if you will permit me a couple of shameless plugs before we begin. So tonight, although we have a very serious but special program that I think will be of interest to the whole community on the dangers of social media to the adolescent brain. So this is part of the programming that the Miami Beach JCC does for the community. More programming such as this that are of benefit to families and parents and their children. But we also do a lot of other different things. So for instance, tomorrow at 12:30, we have an author event. David Whale, the author of Exhale, a transplant doctor who wrote a memoir about his experiences. Comedy night on Monday night with Brad Zimmerman. And coming up on March 8th, we have International Women's Day event with Chen Julie Wong, the author of Beautiful Country. So we have a lot of different events that are for you at the JCC. Just please go to mbjcc.org to take a look at our calendar and register for these events. Now, for tonight, as I said, tonight's event, we have two very special guests, Dr. Jim Winston and Gerald Posner. And we're going to be talking tonight about the dangers of social media on the adolescent brain. So for those of you who are parents who have children, I hope you are tuning in, taking notes. And just a couple words about these two gentlemen before they begin. So Dr. Jim Winston is a practicing psychologist. He has his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's a specialist in addiction. And part of his practice and research specializes on the effects of Facebook and other social media on children and adolescents. So thank you, Dr. Winston, for being here tonight. And the talk is going to be moderated by Gerald Posner. Gerald Posner is the author of over 13 books. And I do have to point out one of them I am in the middle of right now, which I have to take in doses because the information that you are giving in this book, which is Pharma, about the pharmaceutical industry, is just so powerful and overwhelming. And I encourage everyone to read this book. And how Mr. Posner got here tonight is that he's a contributing editor for Forbes magazine and wrote an article about Dr. Winston and the effects of social media on children and adolescents. So with that, gentlemen, thank you very much for being here, and I'll leave you to start the discussion.
Thanks, Danny. Thank you, Danny. Good. Thank you very much. Everybody's off their social media right now in the audience. Thank you for coming. And tonight, yes, I'm the journalist and the moderator, but this is a night in which you're going to learn something really remarkable, I believe, because Dr. Winston, who's also a friend of my wife and myself and his two children, but Dr. Winston has at the edge of pioneering research that he is sponsoring and that he is passionate about that I think will be eye-opening for a lot of people. It was eye-opening for me when I had the opportunity to sit down with him, not as a friend, but as a journalist interviewing him for an article that ran in Forbes a few months ago. And it was that article that opened my eyes to it. Yes, a couple of years ago, we went to a dinner at Dr. Winston's, Trish and I did, and I remember saying at the end to one of his sons, give me your Facebook link and I'll friend you on Facebook. And he said, I'm not on Facebook. And I asked the other son, and the same thing, not on Facebook. How about Instagram? Not on Instagram. Neither one, no social media at all. So I knew that was a little unusual. That's when I started to ask Jim the questions I'm going to ask him tonight, and he can tell you. So Jim, nice to see you. And what I'd like to ask first is, when did you as a parent notice that there might be a problem that you were worried about between phones, devices, social media, and teens, and what made you then get on this into this field?
There we go. Thank you, Gerald. I would say 5 years ago, I'm one of those nerds who walks my kids pre-COVID into school, and we would walk down a narrow sidewalk, and the upper school students would almost all be on their phones and glued to their phones, and numbers of times I got bumped into, and they're polite enough to say excuse me, but they never looked up from their phones. And so as someone who has a lot of experience, 25 years of experience with addiction, this just seemed like blown away addiction to me, that they were oblivious to their surroundings. It's a beautiful campus. Nobody was paying attention to anything else. They weren't talking to one another. It's like they had gone down the rabbit hole. So I began to kind of do my own research. There wasn't a lot out there, and then through this foundation that I sit on the board of, I brought a guy named Nicholas Carr into the school who wrote a book called The Shallows years and years ago. It's probably been 10 years ago. And at that time, it was a finalist for the Pulitzer, I think. But anyway, he came into the school, and I got to spend some time with him. And he came and did an academic kind of couple of days about how if a phone is in a room, or if your kid is taking a test and the phone is on the desk versus if it's in their pocket versus it's out of the room, the studies are very reliable on if it's on the desk, you're going to do less well, you're going to do poorly on the exam compared to if it's out of the room. So energetically, just as someone who's spent a lot of time around addicts, it really is a function of attention. Where your attention you put your attention is where your attachment grows. And the devices are phenomenally, they demand our attention.
Let me ask you, you mentioned that study Nicholas Carr talks about where kids have a phone in their lockers and they do the best on the test. And then some have it in their bag or their backpack and it's on the floor and they do as a group about the second best. The group that does the worst has it on their desk, but it's actually turned upside down. They can't see it.
It doesn't matter whether it's on or off.
It's the equivalent of a drug addict almost looking at the equipment they're going to use. They're thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think we all intuitively can see this. I mean, how many times have you been driving and seen somebody on their bike glued to their you really, it becomes so hypnotic that people are willing to risk their survival behaviors, and they do it without any recognition. It's just become, the recent study that showed that 26% of all accidents in the United States now are caused by cell phones. So 1/4, it used to be alcohol, and then, and it's, there's studies that show if you put a phone on a table during dinner, that it decreases intimacy. So it just becomes a hypnotic device where people's attention just gravitationally, it's like a magnetic pull, people can't keep, and I think we all have this. Phones are ubiquitous.
So we all have it, right? I'm stuck on my phone too much at times, but you're focusing, and we'll talk more about the work that's being done at UNC and the research on adolescence, and why adolescence?
So I got into the weeds on this. So there are two really critical brain periods of neurobiological development. One of them, as we all know, 0 to 2, 3, and the other is a year before puberty hits, which is a year before you start seeing physical symptoms, but for about 3-4 years, and it's the second most critical period for neurobiological development. It's when you're creating the pathway system that essentially becomes the foundation, the highway system for the rest of your life. It's when this process called myelination takes place, where it prunes back and you grow more. It's also the period of time where kids' need for social connection is as powerful an instinct as hunger. So they have to have this connection with their peer groups. It's a very powerful need. And what happens during that period of time has huge implications for the trajectory of their life. There are all kinds of correlates. If you start drinking early, if you start using drugs early, the path of your life is more hazardous. It just doesn't go as well because that pathway system in your brain gets laid down. So that's why it's so important. I mean, I could go on about the overstimulating effects, but that's what makes this period of time so critical.
And you've talked to me before, and I've heard you talk about sort of the dopamine effect, how phones, social media give a charge that we as adults have trouble modulating, but that you can't have an adolescent. They cannot regulate it.
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure, but I think most folks know that it's about anticipation. It's not about completion. So it's, why TikTok's videos are 15 seconds is because you can always then go to the next anticipatory event. And it dumps a little bit of dopamine. And there's a woman in Stanford, her last name is Lemke, who wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. She really describes the whole addictive process and what it does to the pathway system. So my concern and my worry once I got into the weeds on this was that the devices themselves, and in particular social media, because it's an external thing, really is overwhelming for kids in their brain development. They're incapable. None of us would give our 11-year-old porn or alcohol or drugs, because we know intuitively that they're incapable of managing it. And my intuition and what we're trying to do at UNC, and really have started, we've got the first piece of real data to prove it, is that these devices and social media in particular are overstimulating. And I think it's important to realize that the brain, the neurobiology, the synapses, doesn't care about, we get focused on content, the gambling or alcohol. Neurobiology doesn't care about content, it cares about charge. Where the charge is where the pathways grow. And these phones and social media become hypnotically charging for kids in a way that they're incapable of regulating.
In some ways, the ancient brain isn't ready at all for this type of digital overstimulation. You believe that long term, a whole generation raised with devices from a very early age will have much shorter attention spans and be unable at some point in a generation or that to read very, very long works or complex works.
Yes, so the neurobiology of the ancient brain is, there's a guy named Gazzaley out at UC San Francisco who wrote a book called The Distracted Mind, but his supposition, his hypothesis is that we were built to be monotaskers. That's really how we learn to survive. So you're going for food, and then if you hear a stick, you focus all your energy on the survival threat. That's how we stay alive. Well, in my opinion, as a clinician, I'm not an academic, but these phones are inherently overstimulated, and they've created this artificial survival impulse. So we've done, so through the foundation, we've developed a course at UNC Chapel Hill called basically Adolescent Brain Development and Technology, and it is incredibly popular, as you can imagine. It filled up in 5 minutes. They had 320 slots, and they've done lots of longitudinal research and studies. So one of the latest ones was that they found that they took kids 8th, 9th, and 10th grades. We're in our 4th year of doing MRIs. So, and they did an objective measure, not self-report. And kids on average pick up their phones 100 times a day. Some of them up to 400 times a day. And they spend on average 8.3 hours a day on their phones. So if you think about just that fact, so a third of your day, a half of your waking hours, you're involved with your phone, that's where your attention is going. And there's a reason it's going there, and it's not because it's an artificial survival. There's some need that grows as a result of the hyper-stimulating effect of these devices. Because why do you need to pick up your phone 100 times a day or 300 times a day? why do you need to spend 8.3 hours? So that's just the neurobiological piece that's really horrifying.
And I remember you had said that one of the things that alarmed you is when you saw that 50% of kids over the age of 11 had smartphones as from 2011 on, and 84% of teenagers have smartphones. So it was part of the way that they're growing up. But you mentioned a moment ago about the ancient brain really having us wired as monotaskers. You don't believe that there's any such thing really as multitasking, which we all have come to believe we do very well with our phones and iPads and social media and the rest of the things going on. Tell me why that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's an easy one to dispel because there are books written, articles written on the myth of multitasking. You can pretend to do a lot of different things, but you do each of them less well than you would if you focused all your attention on one thing. But kids are learning to be distracted, and their neurobiology is following that direction. So they are good at moving on. I mean, that's why the phones are so intoxicating, because think about all the things you can do on a phone. But the thing about social media that is so worrisome to me is that the social media companies, I mean, I think it's common knowledge now, have really developed they purposefully developed addictive algorithms. And they've hired social psychologists and all to really develop these algorithms that drive kids, adolescents, and adults to the edges, the more stimulating edges of their platforms, because they can capture more attention. And 92% of YouTube video feeds are chosen by the algorithm, not by the person. TikTok is by far the most malignant algorithm out there, and there are all kinds of studies and articles about how it knows you very well, and within a very short period of time, it drives you. It is choosing the next feed. You're not choosing it. And I don't think most people really understand that it's them basically, in an existential, owning you for the period of time you're on there. You're not owning it, because every 10 seconds they monetize your attention. So from where I sit, there's a huge piece of this that, just like in the pharma industry, that is profits over people. There's a bill in Congress, the Kids Safety Act now, that's modeled a bit on the UK Act, that's trying to force the social media platforms to give up their data, because what we're speculating is that they have huge volumes of data that show that this is incredibly harmful, and they're unwilling, in some ways like big tobacco was in the 60s and 70s, to release this information because they don't want the public to know. So we're trying to exert enough public pressure to get them, and it's got to be a legislative act because they're not going to do it on their own, to release some of the data.
I mean, you have some of the biggest companies in the world in terms of revenue and profits that make their money based upon keeping eyes glued to the screen. And so they are using, in some cases, you would expect psychologists as well and researchers and scientists to help develop the algorithms to be addictive. Just as there's work being done that you're funding at University of North Carolina and others, the tech companies aren't going to go easily away on this because it's their business model.
Yeah, and it's nothing new in terms of a business model. It's just the whole notion for me, the reason that I got so pissed off, which is what's driven this, is that I feel like they are really, in the guise of this is good, really messing with our kids' neurobiology. And if you look at when cell phone ownership went above 50%, it was about 2011, around in there. And the concurrent rise in adolescent depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, for girls in particular, it's horrifying. Like the cutting, there is a reason why, and it's not an insignificant rise in all these social, emotional kinds of conditions that kids are now evidencing, because they're relating through to their peers through a device, not one-on-one. And as a psychologist, these devices are allowing kids to avoid the real challenges that are very important to grow up. Facing somebody, reading, empathy is down because kids aren't having to read facial expressions, aren't having to see the effects when they're mean. Bullying is up. All those kinds of things are correlates of what's being done. There's some studies that that show that the worst behavior, the worst thing you can do in terms of effects, deleterious effects, heroin use in boys is the first, and the bar graph goes way up. Number 2 is social media use in girls. It's really staggering how, for girls in particular who externalize so much of their need for validation, how using social media is so consequentially deleterious for them. And then it goes down from there. But I really want to get more of this information out there to inform parents, because we can't expect, my kids don't like me, but I don't really care. And I tell them I care about their brain, not their image, but until they're at least maybe 15, which, my son's going to hate me after this, but because it gives their brain some time to develop without these influences. Because in my opinion, kids are carrying around a drug in their pocket. Now, that sounds a little hyperbolic and dramatic, but never in the history of man, if you will, man, woman, have we had a device that's so hyper-stimulating, that's so accessible. It's different than a TV, it's different than your iPad, it's different than a laptop, it's different than all that. And I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-tech, but I think there's a real strong argument to be made for the need to really protect kids, social, emotional, and neurobiological. We've got some really interesting longitudinal research at UNC coming out.
And when you say the need to protect, because you've called it before the parent's dilemma, you're addressing this. Kids can't be expected to make the decision. So you're really talking to parents who often will use the device to babysit their children, or are themselves on the device with that. You're trying to alert parents to the danger of this.
Right. And so, one of the interesting things, and, we can, I don't know, but in this longitudinal study, they took 220 kids and they followed them now for 3 years. We've just got the 4th year. And again, they had a 2-week period where they took very objective measures on their phones of what apps they were on, how much time, all the and on Apple phones you can. And the kids who picked up their phones above average showed neurobiological changes. So this is the first piece of neurobiological evidence we have that the device itself is proving to be addictive. So in 2 regions of the brain, the amygdala and the insula, which are what called the salience regions, the reward pathways, showed statistically and not small, significant increases in stimulation there, and a concurrent decrease in what's called the prefrontal cortex. So I sort of refer to it as more gas and less brake, right during a period of time when that's a struggle for kids to begin with. So, and there's so many direct correlates to the addictive processes. It's what alcohol and drugs do. They increase your need for reward by growing those regions of the brain that are associated with a concurrent decrease in really the governor, the executive part of our brain, the impulse control. And as we all know, adolescence is a time where kids struggle with that to begin with.
I know you've talked about UNC and what's happening in terms of research there. Just for a few minutes here as we're near wrapping this up, but a lot of people won't realize that you saw these kids on their phones, and to you, with your clinical background, you thought it looked like addictive behavior. You did your own research. You had Nicholas Carr come down and talk to the school. And then you actually met with one of the people from UNC at a dinner here in Miami Beach, and talk to them about the idea of what might become this program. And tell us how that happened.
Nicholas Carr does his dog component. I don't know whether he still does it, but he goes all over. And I asked him if there was any curriculum out there, hoping to really, and he said no. So my idea was to develop an educational curriculum that really, from a science-based perspective, there's tons of science about sleep, like you should keep your phones out of your kids' rooms at night because they are incapable of managing that. The science and research is unequivocal. There are all kinds of correlates, though. So we've developed this course. I pitched it to Kevin Guskowitz, who's the chancellor of UNC, and it's now in its second full year. And it's the kids, the students. It's packed every time because I think intuitively we're all aware that there's a real problem here. I think we all struggle with it. I know I do. I can feel how the phone can own me at times, and I don't like it. But I have a contrast position, being really old, and kids won't have a contrast position.
Having an issue with that.
And I don't think that the people who don't know the program may not realize, I don't think this is overstating it, that the program that you've helped establish at UNC and are funding in part through a family foundation of which you're one of the directors is probably ahead of the rest of the country in terms of its academic progress in a curriculum, developing a curriculum even for middle school.
Yeah, it's the only curriculum of its kind in the country as far as I know. We developed a handbook, which is, I think there are 14 experts around the world, which went on every senator's desk and is really a part of this Kids Safety Act. So we've had political influence in that way, which has been really rewarding. And we're expanding the middle school curriculum to go down to where it starts, which is second grade.
And the Kids Safety Act is a federal act, but there's also possibility of a law in Florida.
Yeah, there's the only state that has one about educate is Wisconsin, but there's one that was supposed to come up, Bill 480, I think it is, Senate bill, social media literacy, but it's a really antiquated definition. So, but it's, I think, going to come up next year. And this is an issue that, believe it or not, has bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats seem to hate Facebook and what they're doing. So, that's one thing we sort of have going for us. But we're continuing to fund. We're going to fund a national center on adolescent brain research and technology at UNC. We're going to get an endowed chair there. I'm a nerd and a weirdo about this, but I really believe this is an existential. I think it's going to change the definition of being human. I watch my kids who do not have phones be magnetized by, my older son is into stocks, and boy, it is like coming between a baby rhinoceros and its mother sometime. Just the pull, the hypnotic pull, and they go down a rabbit hole and they spend hours and hours and hours, and it's hard what that's doing to their brain, because it has to be changing their brain. Wherever you put attention, your attachment grows, and from the attachment, your brain grows structures to support that. Every teacher I know complains about the distractibility of kids. They have a hard time getting them to pay attention. I think there are all kinds of correlates that really, there's no proof, but the tobacco industry, what did it take, 30 years for there to really be comprehensive legislation? We're in the beginning, but it seems to me like a worthy cause.
Look, in the 1990s, 5 CEOs of tobacco companies went before Congress and testified to the fact that their products were not addictive. 30 years after the first,
even though they knew.
Even though they knew. And so you're not going to get the social media companies or the device manufacturers like Apple and Google, the manufacturers of the software programs like Android and the Apple system, to easily fess up to that. You said once, just in wrapping this up, what struck fear in my heart as a writer. You said that you thought that it was possible, and it can't be sure, but that in a generation or two, today's children would be unable to read War and Peace. Not that they wouldn't want to,
Well,
but they couldn't biologically do it. Tell me what you
right.
meant by
So
that.
neurobiologically, I think if they're raised on a constant diet of cell phones and technology, because you're constantly switching attention, and so there's a real decrease in critical thinking. I think we see it on a national scale in the polarization, because there's no capacity to discuss and have differing opinions and have that be a civil process. It's now become a very charged process. And I think that's been fomented to some extent through this technology where everybody's looking for a hit now. And so for kids who are totally distracted all the time, I'll walk by and they have 16 tabs open. They're switching all the time. My older son says, I don't want to go to a movie in a movie theater because I can't sit still for that long. And he doesn't have social media or a phone. I think it's going to change the neurobiological structure so they will be incapable of sitting down like you and I did growing up. I would read for 3 hours. Maybe we're weirdos, and if we're dinosaurs, that's one thing, but they won't have the neurobiological ability. And I think that is such a dramatic change in what I understand it means to be human, having the capacity for critical thinking, being able to process things. There's a theorist that says for wisdom to be developed, you have to slow things down. In the beginning of the internet, there was this whole sense that the brain was lit up, and that must make us smarter. And then there was this whole philosophical shift that said, maybe in order to digest all this information, you have to process it, and that means sort of turn off. Kids never turn off if they're on their devices. So there's no way to prove it. That's my hunch. But I think it's a real horrifying possibility.
Yeah, no, look, over time, you've come to make me aware in conversations I've had with you that I now agree that this is an existential threat to a whole generation of kids. And it's not going to change overnight, but I think what you're doing at UNC, the research that you're funding, your passion about it is remarkable. And Silicon Valley is slowly taking notice of it, and they will continue to, because I know you well enough to know, if nothing else, you're
other correlate,
dedicated.
which is really scary to me, and you sort of, is the tobacco industry. I didn't realize, I'm not quite that old, but they poached a lot of the researchers at the time to get them out of the space of doing the scientific research that proved that. And the social media companies are doing the same thing. There was a woman who did a study, her last name, and Instagram hired her for an inordinate amount of money. And she was doing research showing that the likes overrode kids' survival instinct. And it's a pretty damning study. And Instagram came in, and there's a whole congressional debate now about, is this they're actually doing this? So that's a whole nother political piece.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Time for a few questions?
Absolutely.
No, go ahead. Yeah, we have time for questions.
So I don't know if there's research enough or the time has passed enough to find out the effects of this mind change into the productivity, into the workforce. These teenagers are going to eventually go into the workforce, and how's it going to affect the productivity of wherever they're going to be,
I don't really know how to. I'm way more worried about their ability to connect. The whole, it's a vague term, but the whole notion of intimacy, which requires sustained processing, and those kinds of things are much more worrisome to me. I'm not an industrial psychologist, so I don't really know about that, but I think what we're all seeing is a basic increase in uncivilized behavior, and you can't causatively attach that to but I think there's a case to be made that there's a correlation.
And you think, by the way, just as a sidelight, you talk about the device, the phone, and social media. Social media is the addictive product that's on the device, but you really think the problem in many ways is the device itself. I mean, an iPad you can spend an hour or two on, but it's not as easily accessible. It's not something you carry in your hand or around. It's the portability of that phone that makes it particularly
How many
dangerous.
times are you walking down the sidewalk? I mean, and people are glued to their phones and they cross streets. I've watched this because I'm weird that way, but they cross streets without looking either way. And to me, we giggle, but to me, the whole notion of addiction is that, in the program they say your life becomes unmanageable. So you lose a sense of priorities of what's really important. So if I'm crossing a street, I'm not that addicted to my phone. I look both ways, but when you have people who do not look up from their phones and they are crossing the street and at risk, that to me is a compelling argument that that's an addictive product. Nothing else that you carry around in your phone that's legal has that effect. Now, if you're high, or you're going to have that same you're going to stagger a bit, but you're going to have that same obliviousness. This has the same oblivious quality to the external world. You're just not aware. The kids at school turned me on to that. They were not aware. They wouldn't have known. They said, "I'm sorry, excuse me." But they didn't look up. They were oblivious. That it overrides survival is the horrifying element of this device. So
there was a question in the chat, I guess it adds to what you were just saying, but somebody wrote in the chat about how sometimes they feel very unsafe when they're driving because they know there's so much distracted driving from people on their phones, and was wondering if there's any, what research you've shown on that, number one. Number two is, are the insurance companies getting involved with trying to help put a stop to this, or what is their influence, if at all, in regard to that type of driving behavior?
I remember reading at one point that the car industry was trying. They apparently can put in technology that can shut your phone off, but the invasion of civil liberties, I don't know how that could ever get. But I agree. I mean, if a quarter of all accidents are caused by phones, it's a pandemic in that regard.
Yeah, and I think when you say a quarter of all accidents are caused by phones, it goes to what you were talking about before. People think they can multitask, but they can't, or they take their eyes off for 5 seconds and something happens. There is some insurance companies, by the way, provide a device that you can plug into your cars, and it tells them if you're braking too hard and speeding, and if you're a good driver for 2 or 3 months, they will give you a discount on your insurance. Some of them are toying with the idea of tying into the software, for instance, on Apple phones, and I'm sure that Android has the same. You can turn your phone off while driving. Those apps would let the insurance company know that while you were on the road and moving, you didn't have your phone on, and if you had it off enough, they might give you a discount on the policy, but they haven't rolled them out. But they're talking about that, if that would be an encouragement. But it's possible.
Thank you, Danny.
No problem. I have one other question. I don't know if anybody else has any questions, but you mentioned Congress and laws that are being, or possibly being put out there by bipartisan support. A few months ago there was that ex-executive from Facebook, the whistleblower, that testified. Do you foresee any more of that happening? And what influence, if any, did she really have? And do you think any other companies that there will be other executives and other people forthcoming in that manner?
So I think she had a significant impact on the national debate. I think she really, in particular, that she really she focused on kids, which I think there's no debate about. We want to try and give kids the best chance they have. So I think she had a significant impact. She really started a higher level of debate. Social dilemma which also came out, was very impactful. And I think we're trying to surf that wave and really elevate it to a higher platform. But it's just going to take a lot of persistence, because Meta and everybody, they have so much money. So
They do have a lot
it's
of money,
worthy cause.
but I think that what Jim said is true. There's nothing better than sort of shining the light on them. That's the disinfectant here. And she was a major whistleblower, and the Wall Street Journal did a great thing, the Facebook files. She's testified before Congress, but she's only the first. I think you will see a series of whistleblowers coming out over time on different subjects, but many of them talking about how the companies are publicly saying our products are not addictive, we're doing the best to make them safe for children, whereas on the other hand, in the back of the room, some of the most sophisticated researchers, coders, and sort of psychologists are working on making sure that they stay on for as many hours as possible. And that's going to be playing out in a public venue. Congress normally is the last area you want it in because they're so slow. They take forever to get something done, and by the time the bill gets watered down. But on this, I think that what Jim said before is right. There's a momentum here on both sides of the aisle. And so while that everybody has children in Congress, they want to protect them. They understand this is an issue that crosses over. It's not just if you're a Democrat or Republican that you're watching, on Facebook or you're on TikTok. So I think this issue could have the momentum to move forward with the type of research that he is involved with and sponsoring at UNC. It will move a little faster.
Sorry.
No.
For me, what is horrifying is to see how, and I'm going to say we have all become numb, numb to feeling, to empathizing, to reacting. And you see that, you see something horrible, a fight or a robbery, and people, instead of like jumping in to ask, to help, it's the phone to record and post it, and that is like horrible for me, that we cannot think of anything else but that.
And he has talked about this, which is they're posting that because they know their video may go viral. They'll get 4,000 likes or 1 million views or whatever, which makes them feel as though they've done something as an accomplishment. Do you know, even when you said before that it takes away the empathy or the human, what it is to be human, I think of how many times we go on to Facebook and I learn that somebody's parent or a sister or brother has died. They report it on Facebook, and I hit the little thing that looks like an unhappy face. That's the extent of my communication, right? It used to be we'd be on the phone talking to somebody that we knew and talking about her. Now we write a note, so sorry for your loss, because it's taken place, it's taken away even for those of us as adults on things that are really serious, that type of extra human communication. So I could only imagine at the teen level, adolescent, prepubescent, what it's like.
I think what she's saying, though, is that the empathy, okay, that people are filming this event, this horrible, but no one's calling for help to the police or an ambulance or anything. They're just, because it's a hit, like you just said, how many hits can I get? And that is really scary.
Well, there's also a process that happens through the device, which is you're desensitized. So you can see, I remember watching a video of a fight on Ocean Drive, and there were 15 people around, and not one of them was helping. They were all, because it's almost like it's not really, it just becomes part of this narcissistic, how I can advance my image by putting that. But, there are all kinds of tentacles to this that we see. The Surgeon General declared a national mental health crisis for adolescents, and there's a reason he did that, and there's speculation that he's going to come out in the next, month or two and really call out social media as the culprit in this national mental health crisis.
Well, I think what she said also, the news media to blame as well, because how many times do we hear, send us your videos, the news channels will say, it's amazing. It's become normalized.
Well, it's funny you both mentioned that because it's almost as if we're becoming an observational society. Like instead of a connecting society, we're becoming an observational society. There was one other question in the chat, if you don't mind. Somebody was asking if there's studies that are similar about computer games, the addictivity of computer games on children and adolescents, and do they have some of the same effects?
So there are no neurobiological. So I think one of the unique things about the UNC is we're doing the neurobiological, which is apolitical and unequivocal if we can get. But their treatment centers already, they've been out there for, gaming addiction. So it's recognized. I'm not sure whether it's in the going to be in the DSM-5, but it is recognized clinically as an addictive process. So for sure.
You said to me in some ways you think that the analogy might be to like a gambling addiction.
Well, you can't really correlate it with alcohol because it has a physiological, it breaks, or drugs, but gambling is certainly a recognized, very powerful, where it really destroys your ability to assess priorities and take care of yourself. But I go back to the person walking across the street staring at their phone and not at incoming traffic. It is the same principle, just in a micro level.
But it isn't though the addiction in gambling also involves that anticipatory part where you think that the next bet is the one that's going to win.
Addiction is about a dopamine hit. You have other you have other neurotransmitter correlates, cortisol, norepinephrine, but it really is about dopamine, the anticipation of the next time I'll hit the jackpot. If I pick up my phone, maybe someone, I'm not on social media, I got I don't know, but you pick up your phone with some anticipation. There's a reason that kids are picking up their phone 100 times a day. To me, that's just staggering. So, anyway. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Dan.
Any other questions? Sure.
The famous NSA study where it's just like, most people keep their phone, by them, like 95% of the time, something astronomical like that. But I'm just curious. You know what I mean? How do I say? When I had kids, I have not gone let them have an iPhone. I've already decided that. It's just, computers will be very limited for them. They can grow very healthy and happy without it. But it worries me. It's like you're saying the dopamine hits.
Yeah.
Is there a way? Do you ever think any kind of legislation could be passed? You know what I mean? To control maybe some of this? Do you think that's ever a possibility?
You bump up against the American way and the civil liberties. So I don't really know the answer to that. I think this Child Safety Act is a start. You've got to put some teeth into it. The British Act penalizes if they find that social media companies know that they're targeting kids, they fine them. And it's the only way you're going to get these media companies to shift is if you make it financially very so.
I think Jim's right. You hit them in the pocketbook, and that will do it. But they also have their own long-term plan. What I mean, we look at the tobacco industry as an example of how you can actually change after decades. The addiction numbers, less people smoking, and how you can make a hit. But they view tobacco as an example of how they can play the long game. And what I mean by that is they deny for as long as possible the bad effects. They fight it with good programs for kids. They have their own studies done by researchers that they hire. And then if they're forced to, dragging and screaming by Congress and the public, they'll put a little warning onto the side of every phone that's sold that says, by the way, too much time on the phone may be bad for your health. for your mental health. That warning went on in 1964 on the sides of cigarette packages, and smoking kept going up for another decade. So the warning doesn't necessarily change it. So they aren't even at the warning stage. They aren't even talking about putting that on. But that would be a big gift for them. So they look at tobacco as a way to play it out for decades, possibly. And that is what we can't let them do, I think, in a general sense.
So I have, there's one last question from the chat, if you don't mind, and I'm going to read it. And somebody asked, what about the ABC study, which the gold standard of brain and MRI research with youth has found that screen time is not strongly associated with adverse outcomes with 9 and 10-year-olds? I don't know if you're familiar with that study, but somebody just brought that question up, if you're familiar with that.
So, you know, oh, sorry. In the beginning, screen time was the nomenclature for kind of what kids, but now we're getting into the weeds about how they spend their time and what they spend their time on. So I'm not familiar with that study, but the new research that we just collected really does point to the number of times you pick it up is correlated with increase in the development of the salience regions of the brain.
So they're holding the device is that
right? And
factor.
I don't believe that ABC study, if I remember correctly, I don't think the ABC study was about screen time, but on computers and used for notebooks. It was actually study time, the equivalent of games, but not in a device, not in a phone. So it's the phone and the social media apps on those phones like TikTok that I think changes the equation from what that study had been.
Right, that I can see. And as the phones advance as well, even for adults, like our interaction with the phones changes and becomes more complicated and even more time consuming, I guess. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. This was wonderful. So I want to thank everybody who came today to the JCC to see this event. Dr. Winston, thank you so much. Gerald Posner, thank you very much for posing such great questions. Everybody at home tonight, we really, really do appreciate you tuning in. And it gave us a lot of food for thought. I certainly learned a lot. And fortunately, all my children are adults now, so I can't really take their phones away. But hopefully I can steer them in correct and better directions as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a good evening. Thank you.